For hours after she quietly laughed at him in a lawyer's office, Victoria Hale would find herself standing beside a private jet that belonged to the same man she had already decided was a failure. At 10:17 on a cold Thursday morning, she did not know his name. The law office occupied the top floor of a modern building overlooking downtown Denver. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected gray clouds drifting across the Rocky Mountain sky. Victoria stepped out of the elevator carrying a leather portfolio and a phone that had not stopped vibrating all morning. As the chief executive officer of Hale Aviation Partners, she spent most of her days moving between meetings, negotiations, and investors. Today was no different. A final acquisition meeting waited across town. A private flight was scheduled that afternoon. Every hour already had a purpose. She barely noticed the people sitting in the reception area until a voice from the front desk mentioned divorce paperwork. Her eyes shifted briefly toward a quiet corner of the room. A man sat beside a young girl holding a stuffed rabbit. The man appeared to be in his early 40s. Brown work jacket. Simple jeans. Worn boots. Nothing about him attracted attention. If anything, he seemed like someone trying not to be noticed. The little girl sat close to him, both hands wrapped around the rabbit. Every few moments she looked up at him as if checking whether he was okay. The man smiled each time she did. Not a big smile. Just enough. Victoria returned her attention to her phone. A few minutes later, the conference room door opened. Attorneys emerged carrying folders. The receptionist called a name. Mr. Ethan Brooks. The quiet man stood. The little girl stood with him. Victoria watched only because something about the girl's expression caught her attention. Children rarely hid their emotions well. This one looked worried. Ethan disappeared into the conference room. Nearly 40 minutes passed. Business emails. Investor messages. Flight updates. Victoria answered them all while waiting for her own appointment. Then the conference room opened again. Ethan stepped out carrying a folder. The attorneys followed behind him. One offered a polite handshake. Another wished him well. The meeting was over. The marriage was over too. Victoria did not know the details. She did not know the reasons. She only saw what stood in front of her. A single father leaving a divorce proceeding with a child beside him and a folder under his arm. One of Victoria's associates leaned toward her and quietly said, "That looks like a rough day." Victoria glanced toward Ethan. Looks like life already made its decision for him. The comment was not cruel in her mind. It was casual. Dismissive. The kind of judgment successful people sometimes made without realizing it. Her associate gave a small laugh. Victoria smiled faintly and returned to her messages. Across the room, Emma Brooks heard the laughter. Children noticed more than adults believed. She looked up at her father. Ethan had heard it too. Yet his expression never changed. He simply took his daughter's hand and started walking toward the exit. No anger. No embarrassment. No explanation. Just calm. As the glass doors closed behind them, Victoria forgot about the man almost immediately. She had flights to catch. Deals to close. Companies to buy. What she did not know was that before the day ended, their paths would cross again. And when they did, everything she believed she understood about success would begin to change. The elevator doors closed behind Ethan and Emma, shutting out the noise of the law office and the final chapter of a marriage that had lasted nearly 14 years. Neither of them spoke immediately. The lobby of the building was quiet except for the soft sound of shoes crossing polished marble floors. Emma stayed close beside him, her small hand wrapped around his. The stuffed rabbit rested under her other arm. Outside, cold Denver air greeted them as they stepped onto the sidewalk. Cars moved steadily through downtown traffic. People hurried between office buildings carrying coffee cups and briefcases. To everyone around them, it looked like an ordinary Thursday. Ethan paused at the curb and looked down at his daughter. "Hungry?" Emma nodded. "A little. How about pancakes?" A small smile appeared on her face. "Even though it is not breakfast?" "Especially because it is not breakfast." They crossed the street together and walked 3 blocks to a small diner they had visited for years. The waitress recognized them immediately and guided them to a booth near the window. Emma ordered chocolate chip pancakes. Ethan ordered coffee he barely touched. Sunlight filtered through the glass, painting long shadows across the table. For a while they simply sat together. No discussion about lawyers. No discussion about court documents. Just a father and daughter sharing lunch before noon. Emma eventually looked up from her plate. "Are you sad?" Ethan considered the question carefully. He always did when she asked something important. "A little." She nodded as if she expected that answer. "Me too." Ethan reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. "That is okay." Emma studied him for several seconds. "You do not look sad." A faint smile appeared on his face. Looking sad does not always help. She thought about that while cutting another piece of pancake. Across town, Victoria Hale sat in the back seat of a black executive SUV reviewing acquisition reports on a tablet. The man from the law office had already disappeared from her thoughts. Her attention remained fixed on a far more important matter. Hale Aviation Partners was preparing for a major expansion. Investors were arriving from several states. A high-profile charter agreement was scheduled for later that afternoon. Everything depended on a meeting taking place at Centennial Airport. Victoria expected success. She always did. Meanwhile, Ethan and Emma finished lunch and left the diner. Instead of heading home immediately, Ethan drove toward the edge of the city. Emma watched familiar streets pass outside the window. After nearly 20 minutes she finally recognized where they were going. "The airport?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "We have something to check on." Emma brightened instantly. Aviation had always fascinated her. The parking lot came into view beyond a row of hangars and private terminals. As Ethan parked the truck, a fuel service employee walking across the ramp spotted him through the fence. The employee immediately raised a hand in greeting. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks." Ethan returned the gesture casually. Emma noticed. She noticed everything. A second employee waved as well. Then a third. Ethan simply smiled and continued walking with his daughter toward the terminal while, several miles away, Victoria Hale was heading toward the exact same airport without the slightest idea that their paths were about to cross again. Centennial Airport was busier than usual that afternoon. Corporate jets lined the private terminals, fuel trucks moved steadily across the ramp, and groups of executives crossed the tarmac carrying briefcases and presentation folders. Ethan and Emma walked through the terminal lobby without drawing much attention. At least that was how it appeared at first glance. Emma noticed something different almost immediately. A receptionist behind the front desk smiled when she saw her father. A line technician carrying paperwork stopped long enough to shake Ethan's hand. Even the terminal manager stepped out of his office to greet him. None of it seemed unusual to Ethan. None of it seemed ordinary to Emma. "Daddy?" she asked quietly as they walked toward a viewing area overlooking the ramp. "What is it? Why does everybody know you?" Ethan glanced out the window toward the aircraft parked outside. "I have been coming here a long time." Emma narrowed her eyes. "That is not a real answer." Ethan smiled. "It is the answer you are getting." Meanwhile, a few hundred yards away, Victoria Hale arrived through a separate executive entrance. Her afternoon meeting was one of the most important of the quarter. Hale Aviation Partners had spent months negotiating access to a specialized long-range charter aircraft that could support future expansion plans. Investors were excited. Board members were optimistic. The only remaining obstacle was meeting the owner. Strangely, almost nobody seemed willing to discuss him. Victoria walked beside her chief operations officer, Daniel Mercer, reviewing final numbers. "Has the owner confirmed?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Yes." "Name?" Daniel looked down at his tablet. "Still not listed." Victoria frowned. "We are negotiating a multi-million-dollar agreement and nobody will tell us who owns the aircraft?" "Apparently the owner values privacy." Victoria shook her head. "That is becoming a theme today." They continued toward a conference suite overlooking the private aviation ramp. Through the large windows Victoria could see one aircraft positioned farther from the others. Sleek. Immaculate. Distinctive even among private jets. Several investors had already noticed it. So had she. "That is the aircraft?" Daniel nodded. "That is the one." Victoria studied it for a moment. Whoever owned it clearly had resources. The aircraft was maintained perfectly. Every detail reflected discipline rather than extravagance. Oddly, that made her even more curious. Back near the viewing area, Emma pressed her hands against the glass. "That one is pretty," she said, pointing toward the same jet. Ethan followed her gaze. A faint smile crossed his face. "It is. Can we go see it?" Ethan checked his watch. "Soon." Before Emma could ask another question, a pilot walking through the terminal spotted Ethan. His face brightened immediately. "Mr. Brooks." Ethan turned. "Good to see you, Tom." The pilot approached with genuine warmth. "We have been waiting for you." Emma looked up at her father. Then at the pilot. Then back at her father again. Ethan simply nodded and exchanged a few quiet words before the pilot continued on his way. Across the terminal, unseen by Ethan, Victoria stepped out of the conference suite and happened to glance toward the lobby below. For a brief second she recognized a familiar face. The same man from the law office. The same man she had already dismissed. She watched him standing beside his daughter while airport personnel greeted him with unexpected respect. For the first time that day, Victoria felt a small crack appear in the assumptions she had made only a few hours earlier. Victoria stood beside the conference room window longer than she intended. Below, the terminal lobby continued moving with the steady rhythm of private aviation. Pilots crossed the floor carrying flight bags. Executives hurried between meetings. Airport personnel moved with practiced efficiency. Yet her attention remained fixed on one person. Ethan Brooks. The same man she had seen leaving a divorce proceeding that morning. The same man she had quietly judged before knowing anything about him. Daniel noticed her expression. "Something wrong?" he asked. Victoria looked back toward the lobby. "Do you know that man?" Daniel followed her gaze. "Which one?" "The guy with the brown jacket." Daniel studied the scene below. "No." Victoria hesitated. "People keep greeting him." Daniel shrugged. "This is private aviation. Some people know each other." The answer sounded reasonable. It should have ended the conversation. Instead it only made her more curious. Downstairs, Ethan and Emma had moved to an outdoor observation deck overlooking the ramp. The afternoon sun reflected from polished aircraft surfaces while ground crews prepared several departures. Emma leaned against the railing, completely fascinated. "Do you think we will ever fly one of those?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the aircraft lined up across the apron. "Maybe." Emma laughed softly. "You always say maybe." Ethan rested his arms on the railing beside her. "Because life likes surprises. Before Emma could respond, another airport employee approached. This time it was an older gentleman wearing a management badge. His face brightened immediately when he spotted Ethan. "Mr. Brooks." Ethan shook the man's hand. "Good to see you, Frank." Frank smiled warmly. "The aircraft is ready whenever you are." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Emma noticed the exchange. So did several nearby travelers. Frank departed after a brief conversation, leaving Emma staring curiously at her father. "Ready for what?" she asked. Ethan glanced toward the runway. "Just something I need to check on." Meanwhile, inside the conference suite, investors had begun arriving. Conversations centered around growth projections, charter demand, and aircraft availability. Victoria normally enjoyed these discussions. Today her attention kept drifting elsewhere. Eventually one of the investors raised an important question. "Has the owner arrived yet?" Daniel checked his phone. "Not yet." Another investor looked toward the aircraft visible outside the windows. "Strange." A third nodded. "Everyone talks about him, but nobody seems willing to say much." Victoria folded her arms. "Who exactly are we meeting?" Silence followed for a moment. Finally one investor smiled. "Someone who values privacy more than publicity." Victoria found that answer oddly frustrating. Outside, Ethan and Emma continued walking along the observation deck. Several pilots greeted him by name. A maintenance supervisor stopped to ask his opinion about a scheduling issue. A fuel operations manager waved from across the ramp. Each interaction seemed small on its own. Together they formed a pattern. Respect. Familiarity. Trust. Hundreds of yards away, the sleek long-range jet remained parked exactly where it had been all afternoon. Ground crews moved carefully around it. Pilots occasionally checked its systems. Everyone seemed prepared for one thing: the arrival of its owner. What nobody inside the conference room realized was that the man they were waiting for had already been at the airport for more than an hour. The conference room overlooking the ramp had begun to lose its earlier confidence. Investors still smiled. Executives still discussed projections. But beneath the polished conversations, impatience was growing. The aircraft visible through the glass had become the center of attention. Everyone wanted access to it. Everyone wanted the agreement completed. The only missing piece was the owner. Victoria sat at the end of the conference table listening to another presentation while occasionally glancing toward the jet outside. Something about the entire situation felt unusual. Most aircraft owners seeking major business agreements enjoyed attention. They liked recognition. They liked status. This person seemed determined to avoid both. Across the room, one investor finally asked the question again. "Has anyone actually spoken to him today?" Daniel looked at his phone. "Not directly." The investor raised an eyebrow. "We are negotiating a contract worth millions of dollars." Daniel offered a careful smile. "And yet he still has not changed his schedule." A few people laughed quietly. Victoria did not. She found the answer strangely revealing. Whoever owned that aircraft clearly did not need the deal as much as everyone assumed. Outside, Ethan and Emma continued walking along the private terminal corridor. The afternoon sun reflected across polished floors and large glass windows. Emma stopped briefly to watch a small jet taxi toward the runway. "Do pilots ever get nervous?" she asked. Ethan considered the question. "Good pilots stay respectful." "Respectful of what?" "The responsibility." Emma nodded thoughtfully. She liked his answers even when they created more questions. As they continued walking, another employee approached. This time it was one of the senior flight coordinators. "Mr. Brooks," the woman said warmly. "Everything is ready." Ethan nodded. "Thank you, Sarah." Sarah smiled at Emma. Good to see you again. Emma smiled back. The coordinator continued on her way. Once she was gone, Emma looked up at her father. Everybody knows your name. Ethan opened a door leading toward a private lounge area. Some people do. Why? Ethan smiled slightly. Maybe because I spend too much time here. Emma immediately shook her head. That is definitely not the reason. Meanwhile, Victoria stepped away from the conference room to take a call. The hallway was quiet compared to the busy meeting space behind her. As she ended the conversation, she noticed two pilots speaking nearby. Neither realized she could hear them. Has Mr. Brooks arrived? One asked. About an hour ago, the other replied. Victoria slowed her pace. He is here already? Apparently. Then why is everyone still waiting? The second pilot laughed softly. Because he does not like making an entrance. Victoria stopped completely. The name caught her attention immediately. Brooks. The same name she had heard at the law office. The same name airport staff kept mentioning throughout the afternoon. Coincidence seemed increasingly unlikely. Back inside the conference room, Daniel received a message and looked up. His expression changed instantly. One investor noticed. Something happen? Daniel slowly placed the phone on the table. Yes. Every conversation stopped. The owner is on the property. The room became silent. Outside the window, ground crews had already begun moving toward the aircraft. Pilots adjusted their schedules. Terminal staff straightened their uniforms. And several hundred feet away, Ethan Brooks was helping Emma finish a cup of hot chocolate while completely unaware that an entire room full of executives had just started waiting for him. The atmosphere inside the conference suite changed almost immediately after Daniel's announcement. Conversations became shorter. Investors checked their watches less frequently. Everyone seemed to understand that the next few minutes mattered. The owner of the aircraft was finally on the property. Yet strangely, nobody moved to greet him. Victoria noticed that first. If he is here, why has nobody brought him in? She asked. Daniel glanced toward the windows overlooking the ramp. Because he usually arrives when he is ready. Victoria stared at him. People are waiting. I know. Important people are waiting. Daniel smiled faintly. That has never seemed to affect him. The answer only deepened her curiosity. Across the terminal, Ethan and Emma sat together in a quiet private lounge overlooking the runway. The afternoon sun had begun drifting lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Emma finished the last of her hot chocolate and looked through the glass toward the aircraft parked in the distance. Is that the one everybody keeps looking at? She asked. Ethan followed her gaze. Looks like it. Emma tilted her head. Why are they staring at it? Ethan leaned back comfortably in his chair. Maybe they want something. Do people always want things? She asked. Ethan smiled. Most of the time. Before Emma could continue, the lounge door opened. A pilot entered carrying a flight tablet. The moment he noticed Ethan, his expression brightened. Mr. Brooks. Ethan nodded. Afternoon, Mike. The pilot approached and lowered his voice slightly. They are getting restless. Ethan looked amused. Already? Mike laughed softly. You know how these meetings go. Ethan glanced toward Emma. I remember. The pilot smiled at the little girl before continuing toward another section of the lounge. Emma immediately looked at her father. Restless about what? Ethan shrugged. Probably paperwork. She narrowed her eyes suspiciously. You always do that. Do what? Answer questions without answering them. Ethan laughed quietly. Several hundred feet away, Victoria remained standing near the conference room windows. Something about the situation felt increasingly unusual. She had spent years negotiating with wealthy owners, investors, founders, and executives. Most of them enjoyed being the center of attention. Most of them wanted everyone to know exactly who they were. Yet this man seemed almost determined to avoid recognition. One of the investors stepped beside her. "You seem curious." Victoria folded her arms. "Wouldn't you be?" The investor nodded toward the aircraft outside. "The interesting thing is not the jet." Victoria looked at him. "Then what is?" The investor smiled. "The owner." Before she could ask another question, movement outside caught everyone's attention. Several ground crew members had begun gathering near the aircraft. A staircase vehicle rolled into position. Two pilots emerged from a nearby operations building. Even from inside the conference suite, the shift in activity was impossible to miss. Daniel checked another message. Then another. His expression changed. "What happened?" Victoria asked. Daniel looked up slowly. "He is on his way." The room became completely silent. Outside, Ethan stood from his chair and reached for Emma's hand. Together they started walking toward the ramp while dozens of people prepared for the arrival of a man many believed they already understood, and one woman was about to discover she had been wrong from the very beginning. The walk from the private lounge to the ramp took less than 3 minutes. Yet for Victoria Hale, watching from the conference suite above, it felt strangely significant. Through the tall windows she could see airport personnel becoming noticeably more attentive. Ground crew members straightened their posture. Pilots moved toward the aircraft. Even employees who had been focused on other tasks seemed aware that something important was about to happen. Victoria followed their attention and immediately spotted the man at the center of it. Ethan Brooks. Brown jacket. Simple jeans. One hand holding his daughter's. Nothing about him looked different from the man who had walked out of the lawyer's office that morning. Yet the reaction around him was entirely different. Daniel stepped beside the window. "There he is." Victoria looked at him. "You know him?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I have heard of him." "From where?" "Aviation circles." Victoria folded her arms. "Nobody seems interested in giving me a straight answer today." Daniel smiled faintly. "You are about to get one." Down on the ramp, Emma looked around at the growing activity. "Why is everybody standing there?" she asked. Ethan glanced toward the aircraft in the distance. "Probably because they have jobs to do." Emma laughed. "That sounds like another fake answer." Ethan smiled but said nothing. As they continued walking, people greeted him from every direction. Pilots nodded. Mechanics waved. Terminal managers offered handshakes. None of it seemed forced. None of it seemed performative. The respect appeared genuine. Earned over years rather than demanded through status. Several hundred feet away, the sleek private jet reflected the afternoon sunlight like polished silver. It sat slightly apart from the other aircraft on the ramp. Elegant without being flashy. Powerful without needing attention. Victoria noticed something else. Nobody had approached the aircraft itself. The staircase remained empty. The pilots waited nearby. As if they were expecting someone. Then she realized they were. Ethan and Emma reached the edge of the restricted access area. A security officer immediately opened the gate without asking for identification. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks." Ethan nodded. "Afternoon, Ryan." Emma looked up at her father again. The questions in her eyes were becoming harder to hide. Together they walked onto the ramp. The moment they did, several members of the flight crew began moving toward them. One of the pilots reached them first. He smiled warmly. "Good to see you, Mr. Brooks." Ethan shook his hand. Good to see you too. Victoria felt a strange sensation settle into her stomach. The pilot's tone was not the way employees greeted customers. It was the way trusted professionals greeted someone they respected. Around the conference table behind her, conversations had completely stopped. Investors now stood beside the windows. Executives watched silently. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Ethan and Emma continued toward the aircraft. The flight crew fell into step beside them. Ground personnel paused what they were doing. Even from a distance, the shift in atmosphere was unmistakable. Then something happened that made the entire room freeze. One of the senior pilots reached the aircraft first. He turned toward Ethan. Then, with complete professionalism, he opened the main cabin door and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Welcome back, Mr. Brooks. Your aircraft is ready whenever you are." For a moment, nobody moved. Victoria stared through the glass. Her eyes shifted from the pilot to the jet, and finally to Ethan Brooks. The same man she had pitied only hours earlier. The same man she had assumed had lost everything. And in that silent moment, the first pieces of the truth finally began to fall into place. Silence settled across the conference suite as if someone had turned down the volume of the entire airport. Victoria remained frozen beside the window. Around her, investors and executives exchanged looks that ranged from surprise to disbelief. Nobody seemed quite sure what to say. Down on the ramp, Ethan appeared completely unaffected by the attention. He thanked the pilot, opened the cabin door wider for Emma, and allowed her to step inside first. The little girl paused at the entrance and looked around with wide eyes. "It is bigger than I thought," she said. Ethan smiled. "Most things are when you finally see them up close." Nearby, the flight crew shared amused smiles. They had clearly heard that line before. Inside the conference room, Daniel finally broke the silence. "Now you understand why people were waiting." Victoria looked at him. "That aircraft belongs to Ethan Brooks?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." "The same Ethan Brooks from this morning?" "The very same." Victoria turned back toward the glass. The image refused to fit with the assumptions she had carried all day. The man she had seen leaving a divorce meeting had looked ordinary. The man walking across the ramp looked ordinary. Yet an entire airport treated him differently. Respectfully. Naturally. As though his reputation had been built over years rather than announced through titles. One investor stepped closer to the window. "He never talks about money." Another nodded. "That is one reason people trust him." Victoria glanced between them. "How long have you known him?" The investor smiled. "Long enough to know that the jet is the least interesting thing about him." That answer lingered in her mind. Meanwhile, Emma had settled into one of the cabin seats. Large windows overlooked the runway. Soft afternoon light filled the interior. She ran her fingers across the armrest and looked toward her father. "Did you always have this?" Ethan sat across from her. "No." "How did you get it?" He considered the question for a moment. "One step at a time." Emma laughed. "That sounds like another one of your answers." Ethan smiled. "Probably." Outside the aircraft, a senior operations manager approached carrying several folders. He greeted Ethan warmly and discussed schedules, maintenance planning, and upcoming charter requests. The conversation sounded less like a customer interaction and more like a partnership between professionals. Through the conference room glass, Victoria watched every second of it. The deeper she looked, the more she realized how little she actually knew. Daniel eventually handed her a tablet. "You should probably see this." Victoria looked down. The screen displayed business records. Aircraft management agreements. Charter operations. Maintenance facilities. Aviation consulting contracts. Ethan's name appeared throughout all of them. Not as an employee. Not as a passenger. As an owner. As a founder. As a respected industry figure. Victoria slowly scrolled through the information. Years of work. Years of credibility. Years of success. All hidden beneath the simple appearance of a quiet father who had never felt the need to impress anyone. She remembered the lawyer's office. She remembered her own smile. She remembered the assumptions she had made in less than 30 seconds. For the first time all day, embarrassment replaced certainty. And as the sun lowered over the airport and reflected across the polished surface of the jet, Victoria Hale realized that the man she had pitied that morning was someone she should have respected from the very beginning. The sun hung low over Centennial Airport, painting the runway in shades of gold and amber as the final meetings of the day came to an end. Inside the conference suite, investors gathered their documents and exchanged quiet conversations. The agreement they had spent months pursuing was moving forward. Yet for Victoria Hale, the contract no longer felt like the most important thing that had happened that afternoon. She stood near the window for a few moments longer before finally making a decision. Then she left the conference room and headed toward the ramp. Outside, the air was cooler now. Ground crews continued their work while aircraft prepared for evening departures. Ethan and Emma had already stepped out of the jet. Emma walked beside her father holding the stuffed rabbit under one arm while talking about everything she had seen inside the cabin. Ethan listened patiently, smiling more than he had all day. As they approached the terminal building, Victoria intercepted them. Ethan stopped. Emma looked between the two adults. For a brief moment nobody spoke. Then Victoria took a slow breath. "Mr. Brooks." Ethan nodded politely. "Ms. Hale." Victoria glanced toward the runway before returning her attention to him. "I wanted to say something before I leave." Ethan waited. There was no challenge in his expression. No resentment. Only patience. Victoria looked down briefly, then back up. "This morning, I made assumptions about you." The words came more slowly than she expected. "I thought I understood your situation after seeing only a few minutes of your life." Ethan remained silent. "I was wrong." The honesty in her voice surprised even her. Around them, the airport continued moving as normal. Yet the conversation felt strangely private. Victoria offered a small smile. "For what it is worth, I am sorry." Ethan studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Thank you." That was all. No lecture. No victory speech. No attempt to make her feel worse than she already did. Somehow that simple response carried more weight than any criticism could have. Emma looked up at her father. "That is it?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "That is it." Victoria laughed softly despite herself. For the first time all day, the tension between them disappeared. Emma thought about the conversation for a few seconds. Then she turned toward Victoria with the direct honesty only children possess. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria smiled. "Of course." Emma hugged the stuffed rabbit a little tighter. "Why were you laughing at Daddy this morning?" The question landed gently, but there was nowhere to hide from it. Victoria looked at Ethan. Then back at Emma. Finally she answered truthfully. "Because I thought I knew his story when I really did not." Emma considered that answer carefully. Then she nodded. "A lot of people do that." Ethan could not help smiling. Victoria laughed again, this time genuinely. The three of them stood together for another moment as the evening light settled across the airport. Finally Ethan took Emma's hand. "Ready to go home?" Emma nodded immediately. As father and daughter walked toward the parking lot, Victoria watched them disappear into the golden light. Not because of the jet. Not because of the business success. Not even because of the hidden wealth. She watched because she had finally seen something more valuable. A man who had lost a marriage without losing himself. A father who measured success differently from everyone around him. And as Ethan and Emma drove away into the fading Colorado sunset, Victoria realized that the strongest people were often the ones who never felt the need to prove their worth at all.